Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 38 of Tour of Japan, the review series for the Super JGTC machines of Gran Turismo. And in this episode we're featuring another version of the NSX lineup. This is one of the slightly older models. It's the year 2000 shape NSX, and this team in particular is the Raybrig NSX. Now there are two particular Raybrigs to choose from, as there are with some of the other teams for the NSX. There's the older model and the slightly newer shaped model, which is of course a premium. Now this car is not a premium, and it shares very similar specs, as you'd expect, to many of the other NSXs. It's actually one of the less powerful models though, along with one or two of the other NSXs. Now it uses a very similar 3.5 litre engine layout to the others, but it produces, as I said, less power than some of the others. Not just some of the other newer ones either. Some of the other older ones are also more powerful than this particular model. This car produces 856 horsepower and 513 pound-feet of torque. It's also heavier than many of the other more modern JGTC GT500 class vehicles at 1150 kilos. So still not heavy, but heavier. The PP sits at 645, which is pretty good. It means it's naturally lower, doesn't have to be restricted as much as some of the more powerful models. And the horsepower per tonne sits at 744, which, although that isn't the highest, that's still a lot. Now overall, what's it like to drive? This is a 750 grand car, so what do you get for the money? Well, as I've mentioned before in many episodes regarding the NSX, it does have the trickiest handling of any of the JGTC models overall. Now some of the NSXs are slightly different to each other, and I would say possibly the trickiest model overall is the Takata Dome NSX of, I believe it was the year 2003 model, the white and yellow one. All of the NSXs in general, though, do have that tricky handling trait, some to more or a lesser degree. Now, this model, I would say, is one of the slightly more tricky models, but certainly not the trickiest. Now, with the NSX, as I've mentioned before, the steering feels almost as though you're steering from the centre of the car rather than from the front. And this, for some reason, only comes into play in low-speed corners. In high-speed corners, it handles incredibly well due to the mid-engine layout. The weight distribution is perfect, the centre of gravity is nice and low, the cars are wide, but not overly long, which gives it that more super sports kind of shape compared to many of the other JGTC models, which tend to be based more on large coupes, such as the Skyline. So for high-speed tracks, it's a very, very good car. Possibly even the best for high-speed handling. But for low speeds, the handling is, as I've mentioned, far trickier than something like a Skyline or a Supra. Because those cars, of course, can step out around corners, but they do it in a fairly predictable way where it's not very difficult to counter. You just use a measured amount of throttle and a smooth steering, basically. With the NSX, it's not the same. With the NSX, regardless of how you set it up, that unpredictability in low-speed corners is always there. And it tends to happen at around the 70% mark through a corner. So entering the corner, it will handle very well. Most of the way through the corner, it will handle very well. But then usually on your way out of the corner, it will suddenly have kind of a snap oversteer. Now, it won't spin you out completely, but it just wastes a lot of time. And it's also quite annoying. And it happens with almost all, if not all, of the NSXs. Now, it can be counteracted, and I haven't touched on that as much in my other NSX videos, so we're going to take a bit of time in this video to counter that. Now, as I said, you can't completely eliminate that as far as I'm aware, because it's just a characteristic of the car. But the best ways that I've found to improve that are to fairly obviously ensure that you have a decent amount of downforce helping you, especially on more technical circuits, but also to have things like a healthy amount of camber. Most Super GT cars can get away with about a camber degree of 2 to 3. With the NSX, you're going to need at least 3.5 degrees of camber. Another thing that makes a massive difference is the anti-roll bars. I would recommend having the anti-roll on the NSX at least on 6, if not on 7. Now, it does make a massive difference, more so even than the camber. And another thing, the final thing which really helps with the NSX's unruly low-speed handling is the differential. I would recommend having the highest acceleration, which stiffens up the acceleration out of corners, and also to have your braking bias on at least 20, because that stiffens up the handling, makes the car more difficult to spin or to oversteer with. As I said, it doesn't completely eliminate it, but it makes the car much, much better overall. So this model is not really any better than any of the other NSXs, same kind of price. So overall, it's just a case that if you like this car, I'd go for it. Otherwise, there's nothing particularly that should draw you to this car in terms of what it can do. So, that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.